You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing good, and I've been having some thoughts. In our last episode, we were talking about, is 2023 the year the password dies? And then I think I made a comment, something like, well, maybe we should say, is this the decade that passwords die? And I got to thinking about it. It's like, this podcast really, covers the gamut of identity management, identity access management. And I also think we have to be careful when we talk about things, because when I made a statement like that, it's almost like giving permission, or it's okay to let the password kind of devolve. And I started to think about, okay, if a breach occurs because of the password is kind of pointed to as the reason why your company's on the front page of the New York Times. Whose fault is that going to be? And I kind of thought about it from the perspective of, this has always kind of been one of my feelings, whether it was in IT or in information security. And you're talking to leadership and you're trying to get funds allocated to do something, right? To kill the password is going to cost some money. Or you're going to have to implement some technology to get rid of the password. Or you're going to have a project at least to get rid of the password. And so you're going to have to communicate to business leadership of why they should take some money, and instead of returning it to shareholders, they should spend it on passwordless technology. And I think at the very least, we've got to make them understand why the password has to go away. And it's at the center of so many of these breaches, and it's becoming more and more of a part of that kind of threat landscape. You look at some of the breaches that have taken place over the past year, and the passwords were at the center of those. And so, kind of the perspective that I'm coming back with is just, I think I oversoftened by saying, oh, we have, is this the decade the password dies? Maybe that is what truly happens. But as IAM practitioners, it's our responsibility to communicate up to our leadership to make them understand why this is something that should happen now, should happen this year, happen as soon as possible, and why it's worth the investment. What are your thoughts?
I have a few thoughts. All right. So the first thing is, I think it's realistic to say that this is the decade, rather than try to shoehorn in a seismic change like this. I mean, what we're talking about is password, right? It is literally the only lock on, 90% of the resources that are out there. It's usually just an ID and password. Maybe that you have some areas that do MFA or have some other fancy types of authentication, but you're talking about changing the way authentication is done for billions upon billions of different things that are out there. That is not something that changes within a year, 2 years, 5 years even. And then you marry that up against, enterprises and budget cycles and how long it takes to get things done. I mean, you think about anybody who's been trying to get like IGA or privileged access management tools into their environment. If you're any sort of decent size of organization, it usually takes even just a couple of years to get to the point where it's like, okay, yeah, we're ready to make the investment. And then even those are a couple of years out. I mean, you're talking about changing literally the way people operate. I think it's a decade-long transition. It's like, going from internal combustion to EVs. It's taken decades to get there. Steam engine to, other things, right? These are seismic shifts in the identity space. And you're talking about literally the one thing that is probably the most prevalent security option in the world. It's a password. It's going to take time to change.
Right.
But it may not even be the right, it may not even be the right solution to go to passwordless. I mean, Martin kind of brought up mainframe in our last episode. We've been trying to kill the mainframe for 50, 60 years, it seems like. They're still around, and they're in hot demand because, at least a skill set for it, because it is so rare. Passwordless to me is a arrow in the quiver of identity. It does not mean it needs to be the only solution for an organization. We talk about risk, and it's like, okay, well, if we're going to show, the secret sauce for how we make Kentucky Fried Chicken, of course, you probably want to have a little bit more than a password. Probably, the recipe needs to be under a lock and key. But if it's the menu to go, to go to your cafeteria, who cares, right? Maybe a password alone is good enough. Maybe even just not even having a password is fine. So I think there needs to be a risk-based discussion around it. I just, from a realistic standpoint, I think we're talking like a decade transition to really even see it make an impact or make waves where like that's the way the majority of people are authenticating is through some sort of passwordless approach. I just don't think it'll happen as quick as we want it to.
I think what has to happen, unfortunately, is you have to have that catastrophic event that shows that passwords are at the level of like COVID. They're at the level of 9/11. They're at the level of World War II. That you say, this is life altering. We need to change this now. And there's no excuse for it. And maybe it's not. Maybe if devolving away from the password is going to be fine, or maybe some kind of attack happens based on the password that's just so catastrophic that it makes everyone realize. The reason I used COVID as an example, think about it. Everything shut down. Now all these companies had to scramble to enable remote workforce, had to scramble to adopt MFA, and it happened. It happened. Maybe people had their hair on fire and had to work a lot of weekends to make it happen, but it did happen, and it was because of this like catastrophic event taking place. And I don't know if that's what it's going to take to get to passwordless, but it kind of seems like it to me.
Yeah, I mean, I get the point on the COVID thing, but I also see other catastrophic events that keep occurring, ransomware and other things that they just keep happening. And sure, that one company changes, maybe, or maybe there's a couple in the industry that changes. Um, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to even try and say that I have the answer, but I just feel like it is going to be a slow transition, and it will be driven by budgets more so than like an event that were to take place. The event might be more tactical for a specific organization, but I still think the industry and business at large will slowly transition over to that concept, in the future.
Okay, so let me wrap this up by going back to my original point is that we as the IAM practitioners know where our risk lies within the organization. We understand what the potential impact of somebody gaining hold of credentials based on a password breach, and we need to be educating up the chain so people understand that and can make the decision about the investment with all the information. Make sure that the leadership understands here's our risk, here's the cost to address the risk, and then they can make the decision as the leaders of that business. I'll leave
But
it
yeah,
at that. That's kind of the end of my point.
yeah. I mean, everything's gonna be a risk based decision. So, money is not unlimited, resources aren't limited, time, people, etc. So you've got to pick and choose the battles, and this will be a line item somewhere to say, okay, what do we want to address passwordless, or do we want to, I don't know, implement a multi-cloud, security strategy, or will it be identity governance, or will it be, XYZ, right? This is where, the CISOs get paid the big bucks, and they sit on the hot chairs to try and balance all those risks. Because if everything's on fire, nothing's on fire. You have to try to prioritize some of that work. So I'm with
Absolutely.
you. I wish it would happen faster. I think most people in the space wish it would happen faster because the idea is to become more secure, but also, it's much more user friendly. Who doesn't want that? I think everyone wants it. I think the realistic output though is it comes down to money and time, and those things aren't limited. So you have to kind of pick and choose battles.
What do you think about the upcoming conferences that are on the docket? We got Gardner IAM Summit in March, Identiverse in May, and the European Identity and Cloud Conference in May as well. That's the Cooper Cole conference that we talked about in the last episode.
Yeah, some heavy hitters there. I mean, I'm going to be biased as of right now because of Gartner inviting us to come to the conference and bring our podcast up onto the stage, which is very exciting news for us. So if you haven't heard, Jim and I are actually going to be at Gartner's IAM Summit in March in Grapevine, Texas. We will have some sort of session on a stage with Gartner analysts and put them on the hot seat. Maybe we still kind of figure out what that show is going to look like. But the idea is to bring sort of the flavor of this podcast and this discussion format and have a good time with it. So looking forward to that. So I'm going to be biased and say that right now, but obviously Identiverse is a great conference. We know that European Identity Cloud conference in May in Berlin is also a great one too. We're going to
Not from personal experience, we don't know.
Not from personal. I have not been out there yet, but I am trying to figure out how we can make that happen at some point, either this year or in the future.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, what you said about them having us as speakers at Gartner or facilitating a session. To me, that's such a fantastic opportunity. But I'd also put my personal stamp of endorsement on that conference, even if we weren't doing this session. It's such a fantastic conference to learn and to interact with your peers. Speaking of interacting with peers, one thing I want to do, Jeff, is put together some kind of meetup or something like that around the community that I think we're building here with the Identity at the Center conference or podcast, to, maybe get everybody together at, for breakfast or something, just meet in the breakfast hall and, take a table or two, push them together and, just get to know some of the people who listen to the podcast.
Wow, you're optimistic. Pushing a couple days ago, I'm thinking maybe 2 or 3 people might show up for that.
Well, I guess that remains to be seen. But
yeah, prove me wrong, please. That would be great.
Yeah, no, I mean, if folks are thinking about going to the conference or surely going to a conference, reach out to Jeff and or myself on LinkedIn. We'd love to arrange something, some kind of meetup.
Yeah, it's cool to have just conversations. We're humans just like everyone else. And I think one of the things we'd like to do is probably tap into our listening audience and try to get some good questions that we can ask the Gartner folks while we're on stage and maybe put them a little bit in the hot seat. So I know we've been graciously given some leeway on where and what we can go to. So maybe we'll tap the audience for that. So if you've got ideas or you've got burning questions you'd love to ask a Gartner analyst, send it to Jim and I on LinkedIn, and we will pull that into our quiver of questions that we may pull out at the event itself. All right, we should probably get to what we're actually going to talk about today. I know, Jim, you read recently an article on the Authomize website, and we've invited the author of that article. His name is Gabe Avner. He's a director of content at Authomize. He wrote this blog post called 2022 is the year that identity fully merged with security, a retrospective. It's a very long title, but welcome to the show, Gabe.
Hey, guys. How's it going?
It's going great. We're into the new year. We've got new episodes. And I think one of the things that we like to find out the first time we have folks on the show is really kind of learn about their identity background. And you've got a little bit of an interesting one because I don't think you started here, but maybe you can kind of share with the folks who are listening. How did you get into the identity space? Is it something that you chose, or did it end up choosing you?
So I'd say I definitely chose it. My background comes from geopolitical analysis. I was a security consultant, intelligence analyst guy, and then transitioned from there into journalism. And like all good journalists, I ended up getting laid off because things closed down because there was no good money in it. And at that point, I transitioned over to startups, and my first startup was actually in AppSec. So it was a company that dealt with open source security, and that was totally new to me. And it was exciting because a certain large credit agency had just gotten themselves in some hot water at the time. So there's plenty to write about. And eventually, when I moved on from there, I wanted to find something that was a little more dealing with human issues. And for me, identity is kind of that really fascinating cross between, it's a technical management problem on the one hand, but it's also just managing people and letting people work. It's very much just, there's a front end and back end side of it, but just how do you let people be productive while still maintaining security. And I think also I got into it at a very interesting time when things started to change over a little bit. You started to see kind of this more colonial pipeline had happened around the time that I got into it, and also SolarWinds, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point. And those were interesting days, and that was kind of like when I was trying to decide, is this kind of the next direction I want to get into? And there's just too much going on. So between kind of the news value and just as a writer, to be able to write about those things, identity was the place to be.
You talk about the human side of identity, and I think that's something that doesn't get enough, airtime. We always talk about like tools and technologies and standards, and all those things are really important. But at the end of the day, it's the human that actually has to use all this stuff and interact. And we talked, Jim and I just had a back and forth on password lists. We're talking about the way humans interact with things, and I think it's interesting to bring more of those viewpoints in, because if something's not usable, it's not going to be successful, or it's going to have a really hard time being successful, and it's going to have kind of brute force. So I'm glad you bring that perspective to the conversation.
Yeah. Well, no, I think security in general is always a question of, usability versus how secure is it. Like, if people can't use it, they're not going to use it, and then all the best security products and practices can just go out the window because they're not using it. For years, I worked with journalists in the field doing their security. They're often in Iraq, they're Syria, they're protests in the States, everywhere, and you can be providing the best security background for them, and support. But if they don't want to talk to you, if you're making a system that's so difficult for them to interact with, they're just going to ignore you, right? So you always have to find, in my opinion, like a way to make it super easy for the users to actually want to use, while making sure you're actually doing your job as a security person. So that's where identity is for me. And if you feel like I got into identity kind of post-pandemic, or kind of like towards the end of pandemic, where everything jumped to cloud. So like everything was already identity, credentials. And so for me, it's just a fantastic time to get into it.
And now you're with Authomize. For folks who aren't familiar, we've had Gal Diskin on from Authomize. It was episode 98 back in June of 21. So it's been a couple years, a year and a half or so. For those not familiar with Authomize, what's the 30-second, 60-second elevator ride sort of commercial for what you guys do?
So Authomize is an identity threat detection and response platform. So this is still a new term that Gartner is developing. They have some interesting papers out there that you can check out to kind of get their perspective on it. But it's basically the idea that everybody knows that you needed endpoint security and the network security and the cloud security, and now identity is at the center of security. And it's time for organizations to actually have the solutions that they need in order to have the visibility and control to see, who's using what, who has access to what, how they're using that access, but also how are their systems being protected from active threats. So it's not just, am I doing posture management? It's, am I detecting suspicious activity? Do I have a way to respond to it as part of the rest of my security stack and the workflow? Like, does it go to my Splunk? Does it go to my whatever ITSM I'm using? And Authomize is going to help give you that visibility and the control and the context across all the different cloud systems that you're using and on-prem to be able to figure out how to do it.
Gabe, let's switch topics a little bit, talk about that blog. And I want to know, is this title clickbait or is it something real? So you called it 2022 is the year that identity fully merged with security, a retrospective. So is that clickbait, or was there actually something special about 2022 that that was the reason that you wrote this article?
So I try to never do clickbait. First off, because I'm bad at it.
We could teach you. That's what we're all about here.
No, I've tried to get better clickbaity because it's good for clicks, but I'm just bad at it. I did always want to use the word a retrospective in a title, so that one was like a little bit of just wanting to do that. But I think 2022 was actually a very interesting year because kind of the facts in the field changed. I think if you look at 2020, when the SolarWinds attack happened, and was Colonial Pipeline that year? That was 2021. You started to have large identity-based incidents going on in 2021, but at the time it was still state actors. It was big enough, there's always this issue in security of, I'm going to get by because I'm obscure. Like, nobody knows me well enough. I'm not going to be an interesting enough target to be worth putting these, practices in or having these tools in place. And the SolarWinds attack was, reportedly Nobelium, APT 29, which is Russian hackers, basically. It was a very skilled team. And so a lot of organizations said, oh, wow, that was a big thing, but they were very selective. It was from a hacking perspective, it was actually super interesting in the way that they went. They had access to basically everybody, government organizations, universities, large companies, but they were very selective about who they actually used that access that they got from the supply chain to actually go and breach. But in 2021, you could still kind of say, I'm not really going to likely to be a target because it's only going to be these super elite hacking teams and going after strategic targets. And that's not me. Even if it was, people were still able to say, that's not me. 2022 was the year of lapses. And that's, there was a lot of kind of joking about, like, is lapses kind of the democratization of identity hacking? Because all of their hacks have basically kind of been not super technical from like they're not going through and finding 0-day vulns. Like, they're going in and like they're sending they're like SMS bombing. They're doing things to trick the human element, and they're exploiting the identity part of the threat surface. So 2022 for me was the year that organizations started to understand it's not enough to kind of hope to skate by not being a big enough target. Script kiddies basically can now target me with a little bit of software, to maybe pick up my my MFA. They can annoy the hell out of my people until they just click approve, and it's going to work for them. So maybe I need to start taking this a little more seriously. And I think that as identity folks yourselves, you've seen over the years, identity started off, there was always a security element to it, but it was very much kind of an IT, HR kind of, side of the house, right? There was, you had to make sure you're giving the right, provisioning to the right people, but I don't think it was fully taken as a security discipline. I think that now that it is, been proven by not just kind of the elite level of hacking teams to, but also by anybody who wants to try, identity's now evolved into the kind of like, I hate the militarization of cyber stuff, but like, it's kind of the next, mud pit where everybody's going to sling it out. So it's the battlefield is the mud pit. It's the place where people are need to, actually start to take it seriously. And I think if you look at some of the conferences, a lot more kind of traditional security people are showing up to the conferences, and having a lot more questions to their identity people. So they're waking up and wondering, how do I get the identity, the data from the identity side? So I'll give you like an example. If there's an attack and they realize that certain files were accessed, the way that they're going to be able to understand, what happened there, it's not just going to be by looking at network logs. It's going to be, what did this identity have access to? So I know that they had access to this one file. What else do they have access to? And that's like some of the questions we're hearing from a lot of security people. And yeah, I think 2022 was the year they realized they have to start standing these capabilities up, and identity is part of that stack now.
You brought up a couple of points there that I found interesting. I think, you described early on the types of attacks, right? Nation state actors and sort of, these very targeted attacks, which is certainly one style. Then you've got I don't know, I call them, targets of opportunity, which is really where the ransomware kind of comes in. It's not a smart weapon. It's just, hey, who's going to click on this thing and let me get into their system, and how do I get money on them? And I think that that's what causes two different styles of prevention and mitigation and sort of awareness around it. Is if you are the target of a nation state actor, they are going to try to figure, like, you are the target, right? They are going to do everything they can to get into your system. And odds are eventually they will find a weakness somewhere and get in, which is a totally different mitigation response versus a general ransomware attack where it is, kind of spray and pray or a shotgun style or, whatever it may be, where they're, you have some mitigations you can do about it. It's probably a little bit easier, I would think, to try to defend against, because it is the human element. Don't click on things you shouldn't click on. Watch the URLs, watch for, the spam attacks, right? Things like that, phishing, vishing, right? All that stuff. But there's still certainly a limit to what can be, what can be effective from a mitigation standpoint. So I think you've got these two different styles of attacks. And I guess, obviously identity is important to both, but where do you see things going? I mean, I don't see either of them going away, but are we just becoming more jaded to, yeah, of course there's hacking. Everyone's hacking each other. So what are we going to do about it? Or are there specific things that you see as a point to, as a trend to say, I'm seeing more of this maybe in our own, research, or the things that Authomize is putting together?
So there's like a ton of stuff there. So where do I see things going? To start with, I think I see things going to attackers focusing more actually on the identity systems, identity management, the providers and other identity infrastructure. The past, Lapsus itself went after a very well-known identity provider, and that was also recently targeted and had their source code stolen. I think that, you're seeing more and more attacks going after the infrastructure, because they realize that if they're able to pop the infrastructure, they can hit everything else that's downstream from there. So I think, in the same way that, SolarWinds was targeted because it was a perfect supply chain spot to breach, you're going to start to see that happening also more through the identity space. I agree and disagree with what you're saying before. I think, of course, we're jaded. I mean, that's security. If you're not jaded in security, you're going to burn out real fast. I think that you can, when you look at state actors versus criminal or, just general malicious, it's some dude's job to show up every day from 9 to 5 and try and hack their target. They don't care about ROI. Like that's their job, and they'll keep going until they hit something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to achieve all their goals. And I think that, if we're assuming breach, which is kind of how we deal with, in the post mortem of the, of the perimeter being dead, I think that we have to assume that somebody's already, if you're interesting enough to them, they already have something inside of your, whatever perimeter, because there is still a perimeter, but it's just, it's changed. We'll probably get to that later. The question is, how are you mitigating? How are you keeping them away from kind of the really important things? So I don't think it's a binary, they're a nation state actor, so therefore I'm going to get popped. I think that we can be a little more optimistic than that. I think, though, that when you're talking about the criminal groups, what's the problem with that? I mean, there's only X number of nation state actors who have good hacking resources. There's an exponential number of criminal crews who think they can make a quick buck. So I think that the more we're able to frustrate them by, maybe getting rid of passwords, maybe doing other things that are just kind of low-hanging fruit to make their jobs harder, the more we can maybe encourage them to go look elsewhere when it comes to finding a target, because criminals do care about ROI. They don't care about how they get to you or how they make money. They just want to make money. So
Hey,
for
Gabe,
them, yeah.
I wanted to kind of, well, first, I wanted to make a comment because I think you did a really good job about, you know, not pointing out the victims, whether they are, vendors or not picking on the victims, naming names, things like that. Because to me, it's kind of like, you know, a lot of these breaches that are happening, there's a victim, and then
Mhm.
there's, you know, a group that is hacking them and destroying their businesses or destroying their brand. And there's real people that work there, and there's real victims of these crimes. And I also think that a lot of times when you just keep saying the names of the victims over and over again, it almost is like becomes people start to think, oh, it's their fault. They didn't do a good job of securing things. And a lot of times when you dissect these hacks, it's a lot of things almost everybody's doing. They're relying on third parties for, whether it's customer support or whatever, or yeah, if they're storing credentials in the cloud. Okay, can you really look at yourself in the mirror and say, "Hey, I don't do that. I would never be stupid enough to do something like that." I mean, I've worked in enough large companies where even the top technical architects don't have that visibility across the entire company, and so I think it's a good practice for us, and we follow it on the podcast here because you can go and find out who the victims are over and over again, but not to name and shame them. So I just want to tip my hat to you on that. I noticed that you really worked hard to avoid that. The
Yeah.
second thing that I wanted to say is, going back to the question about your blog is, really pointing out 2022 is kind of the year where identity became the center of the infosec world. And look, we have a podcast called Identity at the Center, right? So we've been thinking about this for longer than the 3.5 years that we've been doing this podcast. However, I do think there's kind of a point where, and it's like a tipping point, and maybe 2022 was the year of the tipping point where it's like enough people are now buying into this that it's now a truth. Identity is at the center of information security.
Wait, hold on
Is
a
that
second, Jim. I like that. I'm going to make that a soundbite. Identity at the center is a truth. There we go. Cut it. Print it. Sorry, go ahead.
ready
Shirts,
for publication?
Billboards. No, I mean, on your first point, by the grace, go us. When it comes to hacking, it's just a matter of how bad is it. If every day I have a RSS feed from breaches.net, and it's just a constant flow of this hospital or that the university or this somebody or this I think some government office out in LA yesterday got ransomware. It's a constant flow. So I mean, hacks happen, and organizations, especially the larger they are, the worse they handle things. Just even the most basic of security things like patch. Everybody's always saying patch. How often does something happen just because somebody didn't patch? Because it's hard. Doing things 100% right it's impossible, difficult to impossible. So it's, even if somebody didn't do what they're supposed to, nobody's doing what they're supposed to.
Well, yeah, I think the next point that I wanted to bring up, I think gets to this point, which is unless you're to unplug, there's really no way to eliminate 100% of the risk. You tackle the topic called identity and access as risk, and this points back to the conversation Jeff and I were having earlier around, hey, there's these risks out there. We understand them as IAM practitioners. We need to boil them up to the people who make decisions about where the money goes, but we have to explain to them the risk. To me, the risk is, the likelihood of an event and the impact of the event. And there's different ways to mitigate that. Usually they have a price tag associated to them, and you have to choose I mean, we all make choices in life, right? About what risks we're going to accept. I ride a motorcycle. That's
Same.
risky.
Yeah.
That's risky. In fact, a lot of people think I'm stupid. Okay. But it's a risk I choose to take.
Right.
In fact, I pay for that risk. A lot of money for that risk. But you get the point. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering, what was that about for you?
So from my perspective, what people need to understand is that with no risk, there's no reward. Every bit of access that you're granting is a risk. And that's just part of doing business. If you're going to open somebody up an email, open up, give them access to the resources they need to do their job, that's a more than acceptable risk. You just have to be able to work into your threat model of, is this, juice worth the squeeze? And I think that organizations are starting to really understand that identity, again, comes back to the billboards we need to start putting out, is at the center of how do you provision access. It's that key. It's no longer, am I at the office? It's no longer, what endpoint am I logging onto? It's about who am I? And all access kind of revolves around that. So if you're not basing your risk assessments around identity and access, then what are you basing it on now? I mean, it's just kind of so essential to it.
I kind of feel like, again, I feel pretty strongly that executives are the ones who are, there's some group that makes the decision around what we're going to invest in.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't understand the risk, in other words, the likelihood, the impact, but everything that leads up to it, then it just becomes another acronym. We need ITDR, and it's going to be $1.5 million. Like, okay, that's too much. Well, that might be exactly what they need to cut their risk, but unless they understand what do I get for that, and they also have to realize that that's not a insurance policy. In other words, like, we end up getting hacked, we get all of our money back. Like,
Right.
it's not a guarantee. So anyway, that's my thought on it as a risk. I did want to touch on one other thing that you had in the blog, which is, you talk about identity as the new security perimeter. To me, this sounds like zero trust. So I wonder, should we say zero trust by any other name? Is this Gabe's spin on zero trust? What is that what you're talking about here? Essentially, is like the whole zero trust piece?
Yes. Short answer, yes. I think that, to go back to what I was saying before, when you assume breach, you assume that, whoever is trying to attack you is already inside, that there's no more castles and moats and big walls. We live in modern cities. Inside a modern city, that there's no more good guys inside, bad guys outside. You have to understand who every person is that you have inside your city, as much as you can, and live with that risk. So zero trust, I mean, again, an overused marketing term at this point, but still a good idea. The concept, like least privilege, I mean, they're good ideas.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate part, is that it's kind of been like, oh, that's just a marketing term. Well, so it's probably one of the most important fundamental concepts that have hit information security in the past 10, 15 years,
Well, it's a great concept. It totally makes sense, but it's like anything else, right? It gets obfuscated and overused by everything, right? Everything is zero trust now. Really? Right. Come on.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a problem, because as soon as one person, once the C-suite starts to understand this is what it's, is something I need. As soon as you have, executive orders coming to the White House saying you need to take a zero trust, architecture approach, then everything's going to become zero trust. But what I like about zero trust is it's an acceptance of risk. It's an acceptance of, I have these risks in my environments. So any ideas that I have of, everything's going to be 100% safe, everything's going to be 100% anything, go out the window. It's all about, how do I mitigate risk? How do I let my people continue to operate? And then me as a security team put all the efforts that we can in place, they're possible to minimize that risk. And that means, doing a lot of dynamic analysis kind of activity from behind the scenes, trying to lower friction as much as possible through a lot of technologies. But also, I think that there's a cultural aspect of getting people used to the idea of, okay, I'm going to have to, pick up my phone to do a facial recognition, like a face ID, in order to get into my password manager, or to authenticate into Microsoft or whatever it is. I think that all those things are part of creating a more secure culture, at work. But I don't want people to be so annoyed with the marketing term that they forget that they throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, like it is. I think it sounds to me like we're all big believers in zero trust, and I think there are a lot of people, rightly so. I think it is. You're totally right on there, right? Is the term has been overused, and it has been applied to every single product out there in the security space to jump on top of it. But that doesn't mean that it's not a sound strategy.
Well, it's not a product.
Zero exactly. And I think that's the part that people get in their heads, right? Is there is no one zero trust product. It is a combination of several security concepts and strategies pulled together is very effective when it is pulled together as a group. Right. For some vendor, and I'll pick on a vendor, just anybody out there, right? To say that, oh, we are the zero trust thing. Okay, you're not the thing. You're a thing in the zero trust ecosystem.
Right. Security is all about stacks anyway, right?
It's the layers.
Exactly. And zero trust is and whatever products you have are going to help you do zero trust better. You need your MFA, you need your ITDR, you need all the different things that are going to help you do that. But no one product is going to be that. It's going to be about, how does your organization actually implement those tools and actually work with your workforce to use it correctly. Like how are you actually empowering people to do security better?
Yeah. I know we're running short on time, and I want to make sure I leave enough time to ask a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu question if I can. We're going to end on a lighter note. And one of the things that we were talking about as we were sort of getting prepped is you mentioned that you study Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I'm not super familiar with it. I took Taekwondo a very long time ago. I don't think Jim has taken any martial arts other than maybe some sort of like word kung fu for developing presentations or strategies, things like that. What is something that people need to know about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that you don't think is well known?
There's all kinds of good memes going around about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The gentle art of folding people's clothes with them still in it.
I love that one, by the way.
Yeah. The memes on BJJ go deep. I think that the thing that I always like to tell people who are getting into it, and we actually have a couple of guys around the office who do it, and also just in my group, we have a lot of security people, which is kind of as a side note. I think that the big thing is kind of embrace the suck and embrace being bad at something for a long time, and embrace somebody really just smushing the hell out of you and hurting you for a while until you learn. Because at some point you're going to get better. So I've been doing this now for 11 years or so. Before that, I was a bad Thai boxer, and before that, I was a bad wrestler. But it's like anything. If you just get used to the idea of sometimes you can have some good days, you can have some bad days. You're going to have some days where you just it could be 6 months when nothing goes right. But eventually you learn, and I think that that's kind of something to know about that. And it's a good, as a parent, as other, it's a good way to approach life. It's something I think that, so if you take that idea and you go into jiu-jitsu with that approach, you're going to have a much better time and going to last longer.
So I'm going to take this recording and I'm going to chop it up so that it says, basically, Gabe is saying use Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a parent on your kids.
So I do. And my my young child loves to give me an arm bars and hates it when I give him heel hooks. So it's kind of hard
like a really
to do.
Pleasant like holiday tradition: arm bars and heel hooks all around the Festivus pole or something.
Well, I can't. He's too small to actually get a proper heel hook on him. So I'm working on it. A friend of mine came up with jujitsu for on babies.
Okay.
It's especially when you're changing diapers, to be able to control the hips, very important.
I think that's going to be a whole other episode that we'll need to get into. I know we're out of time. Jim, what are your thoughts on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or BJJ? Something you can get into? You take risks, man. You ride a motorcycle.
Yeah, I do.
The bad boy of I am here.
What kind of motorcycle?
It's a Kawasaki Vulcan.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not super expensive, but I did make it sound like I spend a lot of money on it, but I spent some money on it. Insurance, exactly, and that actually is good on gas too. As far as BJJ, I don't have any tips for anybody because I've never done it, never done any martial arts, but I've watched a lot of Bruce Lee, kung fu movies, and I would say that my tip from watching those movies is you don't have to speak perfect English to speak perfect English. Your mouth just moves and then the words come out and they are crystal clear.
Kind of like this podcast. All right, let's go ahead and leave it there for this week. Gabe, thank you so much for being with us on the show today. I'm going to have a link to your LinkedIn profile on our show notes, along with the article and to Authomize, so people can learn more about what you guys do over there. So feel free to connect with Gabe if you've got questions, agree, disagree. I'm sure he's happy to engage. I'll just throw you out to the wolves just like that.
Always. Bring it.
So we'll go ahead and leave it there for this week. You can follow us on the web. We're at idacpodcast.com. We're on Twitter at idacpodcast. We started a Mastodon account over the winter break at idacpodcast at infosec.exchange, which is a total mouthful.
We need a bit.ly link for that.
Yeah, no kidding, right? That needs to be better somehow. I'm not sure how though. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and leave it there for this week. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.